Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Before discussing this week's events, there is an update for this channel following recent changes by YouTube to their policies and the algorithm. We will be uploading all videos to BitChute 24 or more hours before we make them available on YouTube. If you would like to see them earlier, please look at subscribing to our channel on BitChute and other social media platforms that you can find in the description. Now that we have those formalities out of the way, the first news this week regards cockroaches. It is often said that if the world ended in an atomic explosion, that cockroaches are the only species that would survive. And while that's not entirely true, it does underlie the fact that they are a surprisingly resilient species. One recent study found that cockroaches can show resistance to pesticides that they haven't even been exposed to yet. The researchers found cockroaches in the apartments and used them as a sample population in their lab. They also used the apartment complexes as a test site for 3 different approaches. One involved using 3 different insecticides on a monthly rotation for 6 months. The second involved mixing 2 pesticides that was used consistently for those 6 months. The third involved choosing the insecticide that was supposed to be the most effective based on the laboratory population. The random use did not really work, and the second wasn't any better. However, they found using an effective pesticide consistently suppressed the population of cockroaches enough but they did not come back, at least not to a point where they could be considered an infestation. Unfortunately, this doesn't stack up in the lab, where the researchers found if a small population of resistant cockroaches survive the efficacious pesticide, they will spread that resistance very quickly. This resistance, as it's been described, is reasonably localized to Illinois. Looking further afield, Uganda is embracing biodiversity, particularly in the use of artificial intelligence. Their adoption of best agricultural practices is catching up to developed nations like America. Unfortunately, they are also very reticent to accept biotechnology like GMO crops. Anyone familiar with agriculture knows there have been a series of revolutions over the years, the most recent being a technological revolution in which satellite imaging, automation, and more can be used to improve the output of farming. Uganda has recognized this and has set up a task force to advise the government on how to adopt and implement this. On the other end of that equation, Uganda continues to struggle in bringing about a framework that would allow them to use GMO crops. That is a complementary technology that would allow them to get the most growth, the best harvesting, and overall the most efficacious and cost-effective production methods. This is in contrast to Argentina, who has approved a 5th GMO cotton variety. When you consider this in the context of their other technological advancements, Argentina has embraced GMO technology in an effort to produce more and more effectively. Add to that, Argentina needs to improve their output of these things without reducing their scarce natural resources any further than they already have. In the end, they are accepting a viable way to improve their output without hurting their environment. Going now from genetic modification of plants, researchers are beginning to understand why humans are considered a fat primate and what the underlying genetic cause might be. Compared to other apes, the human body hoards fat quite effectively. Duke University researchers believe it has to do with how the lipid-storing cells in the human body do not have ready access to the genes needed to convert that fat into energy. As a consequence, the body does not break these cells down and turn them into energy simply because it takes so much effort to access that gene. This means you need to work harder in order to activate them. The researchers further tested this in 3 apes: humans, chimpanzees, and rhesus monkeys. What they found was that 780 segments were less accessible to humans. More importantly, a large number of these were related to lipid metabolism. Understanding this does not mean we are going to get to a point where you can simply take a pill and begin losing weight. It is likely to be a substantial issue that will help people develop better exercise regimes in the distant future. That is a situation unlike vaccines, and as has been demonstrated in Australia with the recent unusual measles cases, a second dose is important. Australia is a well-developed country, it has a good public health system, and it is socially available, meaning most members of the public do not pay for it. What has been found is that those who do not receive the second dose of the measles vaccine, which would normally be provided for free, have been able to not only become infected with the measles virus, but then begin spreading this very contagious disease. Despite having declared measles eradicated in Australia about 5 years ago, there's been an emerging trend in one of their states between 2014 and 2017 that found most of the measles cases that were identified were caused because people did not receive the second dose of their vaccine. The reason you receive multiple doses is that the first acts as a stimulus. It starts training the body's immune response to the virus. Over time, this dwindles because the body does not continue to receive training. The second dose of the vaccine gives it that boost. This has led these measles cases to present with a rash, but not many of the other symptoms normally associated with measles infection. According to the researchers, this is compounded by other issues. One being that about 54% of these cases were acquired in Australia, presumably through infection from others who were carrying the measles virus. However, there were also 23% who brought it back from travelling overseas. Between Australia and certain other countries, about 77% of all measles cases can be accounted for. At least in Australia, there is a large proportion of the population that has only ever received one dose of the measles vaccine, and as a consequence, there is a surprisingly large proportion of the population who may actually contract measles despite having been given the vaccine. The evidence is not mounting that vaccines fail, but rather you would require a booster or secondary dose of the vaccine in order to ensure your complete coverage. Speaking of medical practices and pharmaceuticals, the female Viagra was just approved by the FDA, but there is some pushback from academia claiming that there is a poor body, if not outright lack, of peer-reviewed evidence to support its use. You should be aware that if Viagra were to be approved under today's market terms, it probably wouldn't receive approval, and as a result, the fact that this has passed by the FDA and been approved has raised some red flags for people who are familiar with the territory. The drug is a synthetic hormone that accesses part of the brain, particularly receptors, and reduces inhibition, but also increases neural excitation. Unfortunately, even the FDA has acknowledged it's not entirely clear how it does this. So far, there is a lack of peer-reviewed evidence, understanding of how it works, and further to these issues, critics have pointed out that the people who made the decision to approve it have all either been associated with or worked for another company called Sprout that was developing another women's libido improving drug called Addy, which has been controversial in its own right. Overall, there is evidence that it may provide the intended benefit, and without the substantial side effects found with other women's libido drugs. Overall, there is still a lack of evidence, and only a few trials over limited time frames. As a consequence, it is still unknown just what the long-term effects of taking this are. Further to that, it should only be taken once every 24 hours and a maximum of 8 times a month. The next story is also health-related news. About 9 in 10 of every flying insects in a health setting could possibly contain harmful bacteria. That's not likely to be a surprise to anyone. What is disconcerting is that more than half were considered medication-resistant bacterium, and 20% were resistant to multiple classes of antibiotics. The researchers came to their conclusions on this by capturing 20,000 flying bugs over 18 months in a variety of traps. The National Health Service has responded by saying their hospitals are extremely clean environments and the risk of an insect carrying bacteria to a patient is very low. The findings should be taken with a little bit of salt, as it was funded by a company that specializes in sterilizing equipment and chemicals for hospitals and similar healthcare settings. Along with evidence of flies carrying bacteria as a vector for infectious diseases, another recent study has found that the microbiome of an individual could have a substantial relationship with autism. This study has received a lot of backlash. This is what comes of being a high-profile study that communicates a lot of its findings to the media via a media release. The study used a mouse model and examined the microbiome. They then attempted to replace it, and this is supposed to have eased the autistic symptoms. The study worked on the basis that transplanting a fecal sample from autistic children to the mice resulted in changes in behavior, and then conversely, they could remove this or at least suppress it, and that would then help to alleviate the symptoms. But as with other studies finding association with autism like this, it had a very small sample size. Further to that, there were 3 graphs included in the study that received a lot more attention, particularly that what they contained visually did not match the conclusions or content of the actual data. For example, one graph appeared to be overpopulated based on the actual experimental methodology. This led statisticians to start looking into what they had done, and they've concluded the statistical analysis was flawed. The biggest flaw was that the analysis treated each group as being individual, even if they received fecal matter from the same donor. This meant that they created an artificially larger sample size. After taking into account all of this, then providing the correct statistical analysis, if this was done per a donor, they found that all things being equal, only the number of marbles buried varied. Further to this, inside the article itself, there are contradictory statements on how they conducted their method. Overall, they have referred it to an external statistician to attempt to reanalyze their data and justify their conclusions. If you are inclined to do so, the methods and data are available online. However, the description of the methods is lacking and you may need to find a solution yourself. To top off all of the controversy, critics have also noted that 4 of the researchers involved with this have patents pending or already approved to use microbial transplants like this to treat autism. This is beginning to sound very much like the Wakefield debacle. Chances are we could thank Wakefield, who was the source of vaccines cause autism and a similarly flawed study, for the recent decision of a 5th state to ban anything but medical exceptions for vaccinations. New York is the 5th state after California, Maine, Mississippi, and West Virginia to remove any exemption for vaccinations and access to public schooling unless there is a medical reason that they cannot receive it. Further to this, other states are considering similar action. At present, 44 states allow children to be exempted from vaccinations due to religious reasons. As has been covered in recent weeks, New York City and New York State in general has been the epicenter of a number of outbreaks and a continuing outbreak of measles in particular. Although primarily located to New York City's suburbs, it is spreading and it has occurred in other states. This is due to a combination of factors, one of which is that some of these states have an egregiously low vaccination rate. Naysayers have argued that this impinges upon the parents' right to decide how they are best caring for their children. The counter to this has been and continues to be that allowing one person's child to expose another to a very deadly disease that they cannot be treated for is a far worse act than simply requiring that the other child receive a relatively safe and mundane vaccination. At least in theory, there should be no reason to remove a religious vaccination exemption. Nearly every religion has no issue with vaccinations. In fact, most media outlets have struggled to find a single denomination that is recognized in the United States of America that actually prevents parents or their children from being vaccinated. Much like diseases from the past that are coming back to haunt us, Germany has recently experienced such a reminder of its participation in World War II. An unexploded 250-kilogram bomb has detonated itself in a farming property. The explosion left a 10-meter wide and 4-meter deep crater. Fortunately, no one was hurt. The reality is that roughly 2.7 million tons of bombs were dropped on Europe, and half of these on Germany. It's currently estimated that about 10% of these bombs did not activate when they hit the ground, meaning there is roughly 0.27 million tons of unexploded ordnance spread throughout Germany. The reason this bomb has gone off when it has and as it has is that quite a few of these were armed with chemical fuses. This one was gradually eroded until the fuse was activated, leading to the crater. Unfortunately, this example in Germany is not a limited example. Going through to Vietnam and even later, the American forces used what they called area denial weapons. These would include mines and claymores that they would drop indiscriminately. And even today, these pose an issue in those areas where they were used extensively, as they can and will likely cause more harm in the future when they are activated by unsuspecting individuals, such as farmers ploughing their property. They'll come across a mine or a bomb. The plough will go through it and it will explode, possibly killing them and at least disfiguring and removing limbs. Even in Germany, there have been 11 deaths directly tied into bombs dropped on Germany during World War II since the year 2000. In another reminder of World War II, the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki resulted in radiation poisoning for years. This has in turn led to cancer. There has been work towards processes to remove irradiated material from patients ever since, and there are some. They're not necessarily the most effective long term if you have been poisoned, but they can provide benefit to those who are initially infected with this. Scientists have developed a chemical that can be used to extract uranium. What they have done is test this on irradiated mice. The Chinese researchers made a metal-hugging molecule that can hold onto the uranium atoms, and then these can be secreted from the body. Unlike other forms of radiation poisoning, that coming from uranium doesn't have a particularly effective way of being treated. As a result, the only options available at present are chelation. The problem with chelation is that the chemicals used for it are not very good at getting through cell membranes, and particularly adipose tissue. As a consequence, if uranium gets into the body, it is very hard to remove. This newest candidate as a chelating agent is less toxic than the other options that are currently available, although not perfect, but it also removed about 80% of the uranium that was in the mice kidneys. This contrasts to the more standard options that remove about 20% of the uranium. In slightly more upbeat and awe-inspiring news, the International Space Station has taken a photo of a volcano erupting from space. Rycoke Island is one of a series running along the Kuril chain. It is a series of islands about 800 kilometers long, from Japan to Russia. It was a formerly Japanese island and is now under the control of Russia. Traveling further into space, photographs have been generated of a dust cloud that could be the early stages of a planet developing. The recording is taken of a young star called TW Hydrate. It is 194 light-years away from Earth. The planet as it's developing, or as they call it, accretion, is only a small, bright spot in the periphery of the gas cloud. This means the thing that they've identified as a forming planet may not turn out to be one. However, based on other evidence and the imaging, there is a good chance that this is in fact a protoplanet in the making. Finally, to touch on social media and big tech, Project Veritas has recently released a series of publications that describe how Google has been looking to modify the way that you can access information leading up to the 2020 elections. Further to that, YouTube itself has been found to be prospectively engaging in a blacklisting operation. This is all part of a larger plan to interfere with the 2020 elections based upon statements made in the videos, particularly those that highlight the dissatisfaction by Google employees with how the 2016 election turned out. These actions in and of themselves are disconcerting, but they have more significant implications based on recently proposed laws in America. In particular, there is an amendment being tabled by Mr. Hawley that would seek to change how the Communications Decency Act works. Particularly, it would require that platforms like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and more, of a certain size and with so many users, act without bias and without any particular leaning in how they provide their services. The consequences of this proposal is that if they fail to be impartial in how they provide their services, they may lose their safe harbor privileges. These safe harbor privileges allow them to take the position of being a platform or host to content rather than being a publisher of content. The distinction being that a host or platform is not liable for the actions of the people who put things on it, whereas a publisher, because they have the discretion of choosing what they do or do not host, allows them to then be held accountable for allowing slanderous, defamation, or even copyrighted content to be put on their platform. This would make YouTube, as an example organization, liable for the actions of the YouTube creators. In turn, this could lead to YouTube being sued by every organization with copyrighted content on the platform, even if that content is being used under fair use provisions. YouTube would then need to defend itself and the creator. That is just one of the social media platforms. When you consider the wide user base of things like Facebook and Twitter, this problem grows exponentially. As a consequence, this bill, as it exists now, is a significant threat to YouTube as an example organization if the Project Veritas findings are indeed supported through evidence sourced from the government when they initiate it, and to a degree, if they initiate it, that it would appear that this particular bill has bipartisan support. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.